Welcome back to the channel. Quick little intermission today in our series around the Keep Prisons Single Sex, where we're looking at the Lords, because I became aware of this little squirt being on the television again, and I feel moved to make a video. So the piece of video that we're looking at is actually video from GBNews. It's a programme on a Sunday called The Political Correction, and it's hosted by Michael Portillo and Arlene Foster. Go figure. So they hosted a segment about the trans prison debate, and they invited this Tom Harwood bloke to come in and explain what on earth he was on about on Twitter following Amendment 97ZA.
Well, welcome back to The Political Correction. Now, GB News' political correspondent Tom Harwood is going to join us in the studio now. During the week, Tom took to Twitter to talk about the trans debate.
Okay, Tom took to Twitter to talk about the trans debate, and oh boy, is this boy misinformed. I'm not making it very far into this video before giving an opinion, am I? Let's go back.
Because I was interested that you, a figure of the right, have what I would regard as rather wokish views. And genuinely, in this spirit, I wanted you to come in here and help to educate us on this issue.
Michael Portillo. He's been a politician for many, many years. I can't even remember his past political career in detail. But I'm pretty sure he was a ministerial level politician. And the fact that he's asking this lick of spittle, Tom only just old enough to have his own front door key for an education. I mean, it's like we're living in a nightmare where these children are dictating to adults what is reality. It's madness.
And genuinely, in this spirit, I wanted you to come in here and help to educate us on this issue. So you took to Twitter in particular because there was an amendment in the House of Lords which would have required women's prisons, I think, strictly to admit only biological women. The amendment, by the way, has fallen by the wayside.
This is a little bit of a porky pie here. Michael Portillo just said the amendment has fallen by the wayside. It has not been defeated. When you withdraw an amendment in the House of Lords, it means you can go away, do a little bit more persuasion work, maybe reframe the issue within the amendment that you suggest, and then you can propose it again. If you let it go to a vote and it's defeated, then it falls. But Lord Blencathra knew that he would have to withdraw the amendment if he didn't have popular support within the House. So that's what he did. So it hasn't fallen by the wayside at all. Bit of a porky pie there, Portillo.
The amendment, by the way, has fallen by the wayside. But shall we start with you telling us about that, and then maybe we can broaden out to your views in general on the trans debate. So what was the issue with the amendment and why were you upset by it?
Sure. I mean, you might say wokish, I might say robustly individualist. Because at the moment, the situation that happens in prisons is that prisoners are risk assessed on an individual basis.
I guarantee this man has never done any form of risk assessment ever in his life. The biggest risk factor for sexual offending is sex. Is this a male or a female person? Males commit 99% of all sexual crimes. That's why women have women-only spaces, so that we can be incarcerated without running the additional risk of suffering rape while we're prisoners. Because the only way to safeguard those women is to ensure that rapists don't have access to them, because they can't run away. That's the first line of your risk assessment. Is this person male or female? So it's dishonest. It's dishonest to say that a risk assessment should be completely individualised. Of course it should be individualised. You take a look at somebody's offending history, you take a look at their index offence, you take a look at any patterns of offending, you take a look at what their previous incarcerations have involved, whether they worked it out in probation. But the first thing you do is you assess, is this a male person or a female person? Are we looking at male pattern offending or female pattern offending? Because they're very different kettles of fish.
Prisoners are assessed, risk assessed on an individual basis, in a case-by-case basis. There was an amendment before the Lords earlier this week that would have removed that sort of individuality and excluded all trans people from being in the prison that their gender would inform.
I don't even know whether this guy has not read the amendment or whether he's being dishonest on purpose, because the amendment talked about the fact that trans prisoners would either have to be in a prison with other members of the same sex or in a facility which was specifically designed to meet their needs. So some of these trans people, they are on a medication regime. Some of them have a dilation regime. There are all sorts of individual factors which are going on with these people, which to me, it seems entirely reasonable to say that we need some kind of specialist medical input with some of these people. We need to safeguard some of them as a very vulnerable population of males within the male estate. I don't understand why this amendment wasn't considered an entirely reasonable compromise, unless the purpose of putting trans people into female prisons is to give them access to prey.
That their gender would inform. And so that would mean you'd have a bizarre situation whereby, for example, a trans man beefed up on testosterone with enormous biceps and a beard would end up in a woman's prison, and where a trans woman who was born a male but has transitioned to be a woman, has been on estrogen, has potentially had surgery and all of these things, would end up in a male prison, and that would be potentially very, very concerning with regard to what we know goes on in prisons.
Yeah,
Tom. Do you not know that there are no female trans people put into male prisons? Even if a woman has grown a beard, even if a woman has grown chest hair, even if a woman has had surgery to remove her healthy breasts, her reproductive organs, or to flay part of one of her limbs in order to attach a tube to her clitoris. None of those women would be safe in a male prison because they're female. And the risk factor is that they are female, not male, so they go in with the females. Now, Amendment 97ZA actually provided for a specialist trans unit, which would have provided specialist medical care. Beyond their medical care, I can assume that they would have speech and language therapy, perhaps to do voice training, or various bits and pieces which are not generally on offer to the rest of the prison population. There's never going to be a point at which it's safe to put female people into the male estate. Tom Harwood should know this if he's prepared to speak on this.
And so that would mean you'd have a bizarre situation whereby, for example, a trans man beefed up on testosterone with enormous biceps and a beard would end up in a woman's prison, and where a trans woman who was born a male but has transitioned to be a woman, has been on estrogen, has potentially had surgery and all of these things, would end up in a male prison, and that would be potentially very, very concerning with regard.
Yes, it would be awful, wouldn't it, for that male person who's perhaps had cosmetic surgery to attach a pair of silicone breasts to be on the male estate with male rapists having access to them. That would be inhumane, wouldn't it? Putting them in a prison with rapists. Make it make sense. We weren't talking about putting them in with the rough and tumble male population. If they were vulnerable, they would be risk assessed and put in a vulnerable prisoner unit, either a separate wing for vulnerable prisoners or, as was suggested, a specialist trans wing. It's dishonest, or it's ill-informed.
To what we know goes on in prisons.
The amendment has gone away, so let's go to the heart of the matter. The cause célèbre here was it Karen White? Was that the name of the case? This was a case of a person who was remanded to a woman's prison. This was someone who'd admitted to committing rapes and had committed sexual assaults, but was remanded to a women's prison. So, for instance, when you say things are evaluated on an individual basis, unfortunately, the system fails.
It did.
Let's just remind ourselves about Karen White. Karen White was a person who had already gone through a process of changing his name and changing his identity, presumably to escape recognition for previous frauds and crimes of violence that he'd committed. I know that a very twisted female recently did a video about Karen White, and she's doing a series looking at the crimes of trans people. You might be interested in watching that.
This was someone who'd admitted to committing rapes and had committed sexual assaults, but was remanded to a women's prison. So, for instance, when you say things are evaluated on an individual basis, unfortunately, the system fails.
It did fail, but this was before the system was changed. So the system was changed and updated in 2019, and since then there has not been a single case of sexual assault.
Tom Harwood just claimed there has not been a single sexual assault since 2019, since the case of Karen White. All women know that most sexual assaults are never even reported. They're never even logged. I guarantee you that there have been sexual assaults. I know Dr. Kate Coleman has talked about how ex-prisoners have told her of sexual assaults. I know that Rona Hotchkiss has talked about prison staff being threatened with rape. These are lies. These are dangerous lies that these particular male people who are seeking access to prey are not predators. There may be some of them are deluded and not predatory, but there are some that are predatory. And the only way to keep women safe is to ensure we have single-sex spaces such as prisons. We need to exclude all male-born people from those prisons. All of them. Every single one.
Unfortunately, the system fails.
It did fail, but this was before the system was changed. So the system was changed and updated in 2019, and since then there has not been a single case of sexual assault with regard to trans or people who claim that they're trans. I think Karen White has never said that they were trans at all.
It's a lie when people say that Karen had never expressed a trans identity. Karen had already been going to trans groups. Karen had already made reports against his neighbours for transphobia. Karen was signed up to this ideology hook, line and sinker because it provides access to victims. He's a predator. He's looking for prey because that's what they do.
Karen White has never said that they were trans at all until he or she ended up in prison.
Did you catch that? He was talking about Karen White and he said he or she because he's struggling with what to do about his pronouns now because he's claiming this Karen White person is not trans, but at the same time, he can't quite bring himself to call this person a male. So he's saying he or she, as if we don't know. As if the whole point of the conversation is that we do know. It's bananas.
Has never said that they were trans at all until he or she ended up in prison. I think there's a reason to raise an eyebrow there, and I think there was a definite failing in that case back before the system was strengthened, before it was changed in 2019. I think it's important to note that in the last 3 years, there's not been a single case of sexual assault in a prison.
But I assume you might share my scepticism about bureaucracies and about the state. I mean, the fact is that these mistakes will be made again and again.
I think that sometimes mistakes are made. However, and that's why you need strong safeguards. I don't think that it's a reason, however, to lean so far the other way into the extremity of this particular amendment.
This amendment's so extreme, it's calling for trans people to be kept safe. It was calling for people to be kept safe either in with their own birth sex, where it was risk assessed that that was necessary, as is the case now. 90% of trans women are held on the male estate now because it's not safe. It's recognised that it's not safe to put them in with the women. They would be given an option under Amendment 97ZA that they could go to a trans unit, where they would be safe, where they would be cared for, where they would be given greater liberty in terms of what you're allowed to wear in prison, for instance. That is the most compassionate option. It's more compassionate than a lot of us feel we should be towards a population that includes people that are in prison for serious crimes of violence against women and children.
And that's why you need strong safeguards. I don't think that it's a reason, however, to lean so far the other way into the extremity of this particular amendment that would lead to the quite ridiculous situation whereby bearded, muscly trans men who...
Imagine the horror if a bearded person was in with the women, because women don't have any facial hair. There are never any women in prisons with a beard. I guarantee you there are women in prison with beards. I guarantee you there are women with beards in prison. Not just because there are trans men in prison, but because there are women that are older, that have got facial hair that they haven't removed because they're not under the male gaze. Because there are women with PCOS that are in prison. Because it's not actually a pillow fight in a 1980s teen movie. It's prison.
Whereby bearded, muscly trans men who were born women would end up in female prisons. That would be concerning. And similarly, there's going to be clearly some situations where trans women would be really at risk in a male prison. And I think that sometimes when you see discourse around this, online in particular, people jump to what their conclusion, what they think a trans person is, what they think a trans person looks like.
Well, luckily, we don't have to imagine it because we can actually look at the records to see what a trans person looks like that's been convicted of crimes and is being assessed for whether they get transferred into the female estate or whether they get to serve out their sentence in the male estate or in the trans unit. We can see what they look like. And they don't all look like delicate flowers, do they?
And I think that sometimes when you see discourse around this, online in particular, people jump to what their conclusion, what they think a trans person is, what they think a trans person looks like. And very often that leads to some really quite grotesque imagery of sort of, oh, it's just a man in a dress, that sort of thing.
Grotesque imagery of a man in a dress. You know what's grotesque? Women getting raped when they should be safe in prison. That's grotesque. That's what grotesque is.
People jump to what their conclusion, what they think a trans person is, what they think a trans person looks like. And very often that leads to some really quite grotesque imagery of sort of, oh, it's just a man in a dress, that sort of thing. And that's really not the case. And I think if more people understood and knew potentially trans people, they wouldn't jump to those conclusions.
Activists often claim that the reason why we hold views that mean that they shouldn't be included in women-only spaces is because we don't know trans people. It is because we know about trans people that we have reached the conclusions that we have. Many of us started out as activists in favour of trans inclusion until we realised the dreadful, dreadful harm that was happening as a result of those policies. You cannot claim that we do not know any trans people. We do. Most of us have spent more time, I'll warrant, researching this issue than you have. Thanks for watching this video today. Please do subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. You can leave me a like or a dislike. Please share this video, and I'll see you again soon.